Hello everyone, can you hear me? My name is Mary P. Mills. I'm a partner and an editor here at Tortoise. Welcome to our G7 Billion Summit. If you've been with us all day, congratulations on sticking with it so far. This will be your fifth session of the day, your fifth digital thinking. A digital thinking, of course, being where we welcome you to our digital newsroom to hear your ideas and your point of view, which we hope at some point will inform our journalism. This session is on the Sustainable Development Goals, how they've been impacted by COVID, and whether it's time for an update. Before we get started, I should say thank you to the One Campaign, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and Project Everyone for supporting the summit. We're hugely grateful for that. And before I introduce our guests, I want to tell you the intricacies of Zoom, which I'm sure you know already, which is to say you've been automatically muted when you came onto the call. It doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. We definitely do. But there are two ways to do that. You raise your hand with a little raise hand button at the bottom of the screen, or you can contribute to the chat where my colleague Basha Cummings is there to chat with you, and she may ask you if you'd like to speak. So do keep an eye, hello Basha, so do keep an eye on that space there. And I should also lastly say we are recording this discussion, so we might edit it and use it on our digital platforms later. And I think I also need to say that you should be, if you are in the chat, you should be writing to panelists and attendees, and then everyone can see your contributions. I'm also incredibly grateful to our brilliant, impressive guests who've joined us to kick off the discussion. I'll just quickly introduce them now. They are Kate Garvey, who is the co-founder of Project Everyone. Hello, Kate. Eddie Ndopu, who is the activist and who's an activist and one of the UN General Secretary's advocate for the Sustainable Development Goals, and David Miliband, familiar face, CEO of the International Rescue Committee. I'm going to come to you first, Kate, but before I do, if possible, I know that they were scrolling before when we were waiting to that music, but I thought it would be helpful just to have a quick look at the goals, the 17 goals, a very random number, but as we've discussed, Kate, already, the randomness almost underlines the authenticity of why they are important. And I just thought we would go through them quickly. For those that aren't familiar, they are: number 1, no poverty; number 2, zero hunger; 3, good health and well-being; 4, quality education; 5, gender equality; 6, clean water and sanitation; 7, affordable and clean energy; 8, decent work and economic growth; 9, industry and innovation infrastructure; 10, reduced inequalities; 11, sustainable cities and communities; 12, responsible consumption and production; 13, climate action; 14, life below water, which of course is ocean conservation; 15, life on land, which is conserving ecosystems and that sort of thing; 16, peace, justice and strong institutions; and 17, revitalizing global partnerships. These are, of course, based on some of the 8 original Millennium Development Goals, but they've been re-examined with additional focus on climate 5 years ago. Kate, starting with you, we should just cut right to it. Are these still the right goals for now?
100%. I thought you were going to test me on them. I thought that was going to be my first.
There will be a test at the end of the session, and anyone can be picked on. Like school.
It actually amused me because the first year that we set up Project Everyone, because we believe so much in the need for a new set of goals after the MDGs, one of the things we did was spend time with some great creative people in making these icons. And you've just redone them. Brilliant. So yes, I think 100% they are the right plan. They were agreed by 193 countries 5 years ago. I think you'd be hard pressed to go back on something like that and try and get a better one. It was a mammoth task, a proper process, consultation with civil society, businesses, and many different sort of machinations through that. So it was a tremendous achievement to agree on 17. And yes, there is no doubt that we expected 10 and 17 didn't seem quite right and trip off the tongue, but you know, it does give it some sort of, you know, you wouldn't make that number up. So I think it's played, it's played to their strength. So it is the plan, and it is the guide, and holds the solutions for how we will build back better.
So I mean, I can see a few people in the chat, Basha, saying, you know, how many of you would actually have known all of them. Someone saying I wouldn't have guessed more than 5, and people saying, you know, it does seem like a lot. Do you think that the number has sort of confused the message?
Well, I suppose that's where we have come in. We've tried to use a collective badge to sort of demonstrate they are the whole and they're interconnected. They're also universal. I think that's important, particularly when this pandemic is clearly pandemic in the title, but a universal crisis. They do impact developed countries as well as developing, and that was not the case with the MDGs. So I think that the fact that they include climate targets and goals is incredibly important. It's not just about development, it's about sustainable development. That is for the modern times, and it includes inequalities. There is one goal for gender, but goal 10, there you go, hopefully I got that right, is about all inequalities. And I think in this day and age, that is quite relevant.
You got it right. David, can I come to you next? My other question is, one of the reasons I wanted to read them is because when you read them out, they feel, even one of them feels so unbelievably ambitious. I guess my question is, are they too ambitious, or was the moonshot approach the only right approach?
Well, first of all, let me say it's really nice to be with you all. I want to call out the amazing job that Kate and her team have done in popularizing these goals and taking her badge and the interconnected nature of them and making them something that is visible globally over the last 5 years. Having said that, I think there are two really fundamental problems that we have to open ourselves up to and discuss in this session. The first is that the goals are what they say in the name. They're a goal, they're not a plan. And my call 5 years ago on behalf of the International Rescue Committee, which works with refugees and displaced people around the world in humanitarian crisis, my call was to turn the applause for the goals into action through accountability. Having a goal is not the same as saying that there's accountability for delivering it and a plan to do so. And I think that there remains an enormous amount of work to be done, even before COVID, in getting anywhere near the kind of goals that exist. Just in parenthesis, I challenge anyone to say that any of the goals aren't important. So I'm not in the business of saying we should whittle them down. You can't take parts of them and say no. But I think point one, there's got to be accountability and plan, and in too many areas there isn't. Second, that relates to my really fundamental point that will run through, I think, everything I say in this session. We cannot see the Sustainable Development Goals as the second half of the anti-poverty challenge started by the Millennium Development Goals for this reason. The poor today, especially the extreme poor, are in very different circumstances than the extreme poor from 2000 to 2015. And in very crude terms, I put it like this. Between 2000 and 2015, the extreme poor were found in stable but poor states. India, China being prime examples, but Ethiopia and Africa would also be an example. Today, 43% of the extreme poor, by 2030, at least 65% of the extreme poor will not be in stable but poor places. They will be in unstable, war-torn, conflict-ridden places. And that changes the agenda, because the agenda for the Millennium Development Goals was, how can countries have a development plan that's suited to a peaceful circumstance? What's the role of markets? What's the role of state building? The people that we work with who are the extreme poor, they're in places like Yemen. They are the Rohingya who have been chased out of Myanmar. They are the extreme poor in South Sudan who are preoccupied with the war, the ongoing conflict there. There's a wholly different set of tools that need to be developed, because the state doesn't exist in the same way, government doesn't, markets don't exist in the same way, and the international community isn't viewed in the same way. You just have to look at the fact that World Health Organization, MSF, others were attacked in the Democratic Republic of Congo during the Ebola outbreak and during this most recent, in the finishing of the Ebola outbreak. So my second point is, let's understand who we're talking about when we're talking about ending world poverty. It's a different group of people that's going to need a different mix of civil society, international effort, and local governments.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's worth bringing in a couple of facts of what COVID has done to these goals at this point, and that, you know, you could do something for every single goal there is. But for example, during the crisis, 70 countries have halted their childhood vaccination program, and you know, COVID has caused the first increase in global poverty in decades. 71 million pushed into extreme poverty by COVID. Is it possible, Kate, again, that COVID could derail the whole project?
I think you're right. Progress has halted. I work with the Gates Foundation on something called Goalkeepers, which is monitors the goals each year and campaigns for it. And I think, you know, this is, we have said every year progress is possible, but it's not inevitable. And sure enough, this has halted things in its tracks. But we are the optimists here. So I think finding the ways that we can use this crisis to leap back, get us back on track is so important, but it absolutely will be down to global cooperation. It will absolutely be about learning from some of these mistakes. Had we followed some of the Sustainable Development Goals targets and achieved some of them, we would have had better universal health coverage, we would have had better quality care, there would have been a better safety net, there would have been greater digital reach, all these things that are coming into play now, and our economies would have been more sustainable. So I don't think it's a reason to stop. I think it does mean our job is going to be harder. Okay,
thank you. Come to Eddie now. You're one of the UN Secretary General's 17 advocates for the goals. In fact, you're the youngest of the team, and you push for action from countries and businesses to help actually reach the goals or get somewhere near them. Can you just tell us a bit about what your experience has been like so far?
Sure, absolutely. So, you know, as one of the youngest members of the UN Secretary General's group of 17 advocates, my role really has been to underscore the importance of leaving nobody behind, which is the mantra that underpins the SDG agenda. And part of that means paying specific attention to the people that are furthest behind the line of opportunity. You know, I'm constantly asked, well, which goal do you work on specifically? And I think that that's the wrong question to ask, because in order for us to really make a dent on the agenda, we need to look at the goals together in the agenda in its entirety, because the goals cannot be looked at in isolation from one another. And I think that what we're bearing witness to now in this particular historical moment is that there seems to be a gap between the discourse around social justice and the discourse around international development. There's a massive gap between the two of them. And I think that what is incumbent upon all of us right now is to bridge that gap and really you know, bring into view the ways in which the most marginalized segments of society are experiencing multiple forms of precariousness at the same time, right? So the same people that are disproportionately impacted by COVID are the people that are bearing the worst of the climate crisis. And so what does that mean, right? Like, how do we then reimagine the methodology that we use, you know, to, you know, think about the goals in an interdisciplinary fashion and in a multi-stakeholder way?
Okay, and I should say that, you know, you and I spoke before this event. We spoke yesterday, in fact, and, you know, I asked you what the difference was, you know, pre-COVID and now. And I have to say, I wrote down some of the things that you said, some direct quotes, which were catastrophically awful and lackluster and anemic before COVID. And now it's even worse. Why is it so hard to push the dial on these things?
Well, I think it's hard for several reasons. I think the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that the methodology for policymaking is perhaps somewhat outdated. We understand that people embody a multiplicity of experiences. simultaneously. We are never just one thing, but we tend to speak about the goals in isolation from one another, right? So we speak about gender on the one side, we speak about climate on the other, we speak about poverty and hunger, and we speak about these things in very compartmentalized ways. And that's the way that the public policy sort of framework is really reflective of that. So I think that what the invitation of this moment is for us to really think quite critically about the ways in which we need to change policymaking in order to keep up with the goals. You know, before the COVID pandemic, healthcare was not really top of mind. And before that, you know, we're speaking about climate, but, you know, climate itself wasn't really top of mind. So it seems to me as though with the discourse, we're always catching up to the moment rather than allowing the goals to set the agenda. And so, you know, I think that that's part of the challenge that leaders are confronted with right now.
Okay, thanks. I think we've got Ran Boydell who said something in the chat to David's point about them being goals rather than a plan. Are you there, Ran?
Yes, I am.
Hi, would you like to make your point?
Thank you for this.
Could you turn it on so we could see you? There you go. Hi.
You got me? My involvement is mostly in teaching at university level, and I often use the SDGs as the structure for how to consider a particular aspect of whatever industry the students are from. And I admire the ambition of the goals as a total, but because of the way they're phrased, it's sometimes difficult to link a particular task to a particular action. You know, there's the absence of air in there anywhere. So where do we put air pollution? Where do we put that into the goals? And I know there is guidance that's been published, but I feel that some really pragmatic guidance and advice on how we implement these things in the real world is important. And I think this is actually more important in developed countries than in undeveloped countries. A lot of the big issue stuff's about the reduction in poverty, which David spoke about, which are there. It's very easy to see how they fit the goals, but yet less so in developed countries, is my experience.
David, can I come to you on that point? Because it's a fair point, I think, you know, in sort of thinking about this session in advance, I was, you know, you could read a lot of things about the goals and how far we are behind on them and how COVID's made it worse, but it's quite hard to find practical solutions. You know, whose role is that, and how should we be taking that forward?
Well, I'm surprised to hear you say that a bit, because I think we've got manifold solutions, but they're not taken to scale. I mean, the trouble with the development and humanitarian sectors, apart from the fact that they operate separately, which is something we can come back to, the problem is there's too many boutique projects and not enough taken to scale. And I think if you look across education, malnutrition, maternal health, you can see really outstanding examples of what can be done. And the frustration is that donors and sometimes NGOs and sometimes governments want to reinvent the wheel. And I'm happy to go into any detail on some of those. But let me just draw back, though, to make a bigger point. We can't separate the policy here from the politics. I don't mean politics in terms of party politics. I'm leading an NGO, which is a non-governmental, non-partisan organization. But policy and politics are related. And the politics at the moment are not ones of grabbing and gripping big global problems. They're a retreat into what Yuval Harari calls a network of fortresses. And the US obviously is part of that, but there's a debate in the UK, which I'm afraid is redolent of that as well. Now, in this time when governments are in retreat from big global problems, sometimes under the heading of isolationism, sometimes under the heading of nationalism, sometimes under the heading of populism, we have to rewrite the formula for how big change happens. Big change happens when governments, civil society, mass mobilization, and businesses and NGOs innovate. Government leadership, mass mobilization, business and NGO innovation. Now, those are the three keys to any big social or economic or political movement of change, but they don't have to happen in that order. And we're not going to get government leadership. That's the importance of mass mobilization. You can see that around the climate issue, but it's also the importance of business and NGO innovation. And I agree that the breadth and comprehensiveness of the Sustainable Development Goals can become a vice. But the truth is we've got to turn it into a virtue. And the virtue is that it can speak to any business, any organization in any walk of life. And we've got to make that a basis for really serious evidence-based interventions. And my plea to people would be to follow the evidence. Don't just follow the money, follow the evidence. Because we actually do know in the range of areas that are covered what can make a huge difference. My frustration is that before COVID, we were helping 11,000 kids, Syrian kids in Lebanon get educated when we could, and there are 250,000 without any help at all. My frustration on malnutrition is that 80% of malnourished, acutely malnourished under fives get no help at all from the UN system, but we've got a plan that can actually make a difference. And so I would say, let's not fall into the trap of believing there aren't solutions, but let's recognize that there's a bigger political problem that needs to be addressed through the innovation and through the mobilization to support it.
Okay, all right. And just to go back to Eddie, one of the other things you were saying on the call with me was that you know, far from being that first question about ambition and whether they were too ambitious, in your mind, speaking to some of what David's saying, you felt that in fact they weren't ambitious enough.
Yeah, I know that sounds like quite an audacious thing to say, but I think that what I really mean by that, I think if we look at pre-COVID, what really strikes me is that the fact that, you know, the statistics vary anywhere between 100 and 500 million people are likely to be plunged into extreme poverty as a result of the pandemic and the consequences associated with the pandemic. And what that suggests to me is that people were already living under really precarious conditions, right? The fact that we as a global society have counted people who've moved, say, from $1 a day to an existence of $3 a day, that was counted in our tally of progress, right? And what that suggests to me is that there's something problematic in the sense that people weren't, the resilience that people needed to be able to withstand the consequences of the pandemic was simply not there. Those kinds of social safety nets didn't exist, right? So what is it that we're counting in our data? What is it that what is our conception of progress that we are utilizing to be able to say that we've made progress? And so what I'm saying is that I think we need to go beyond the minimum thresholds that we've embraced and move beyond the logic of compliance and beyond the logic of ticking a box in order to say that we've made progress. I'll use a very practical example. I use a wheelchair. I'm a disability advocate, and it really amazes me that whenever we speak about accessibility, we tend to confine access to the installation of a ramp, right? We don't think about access beyond the built environment, right? That there's so much more, that what makes a space accessible isn't a ramp, it's the connection, the possibility that a space engenders for people of all identities to come together. And I think that same logic applies to the work that we do on the goals, right? Like, how do we think about the goals beyond the logic of compliance and beyond the minimum thresholds that we use in order to make sense of progress? And so therefore, that comes down to ambition and really thinking about the kinds of lives that people ought to live that are dignified and that are about self-actualization, rather than a very myopic notion of numerical justice.
Right, okay, thanks for that. Can I come to Joshua Russell, who's had his hand up for a while, and then Alison, who I think was making some interesting points in the chat. Joshua, are you there?
Yes. So COVID has given out quite a large call to action. And I think we've seen that with a rise in activism. People have never been so connected, and with the downturn in economics, we've got a lot of people with a lot of time on their hands. I'm a teacher who's medically vulnerable. I've left the classroom. I've previously worked as a fundraiser, and I've spent a lot of time volunteering and campaigning. I've been a bit discouraged. I've reached out to a lot of organizations to offer aid, offer support, and I've got somewhere. I've spoken at the Labour Policy Forum. I've had responses back from open letters. I created my own organization, but sometimes it feels like it's quite hard. There's not much of a framework for getting involved. So my question is, how can those of us at home who hear that call to action, who want to respond, how can we best help out? Is there some sort of way for us to be ambassadors within our communities, to take advantage of communication and be a part of the movement to start addressing these problems?
Okay, thank you, Joshua. Kate, that seems like a good question for you, actually.
Sure. So, and in fact, it ties in with a couple of things that both Eddie and David said before, because I think David said it at the beginning, whether, you know, accepting that the plan or the goals came into place, what happens next? And I think the UN itself plays an important part in that. The goals come out of the United Nations. The challenge for them was, and how do they help make them accountable, which was David's point, make the solutions that are out there more famous and understood, and better taken on by the governments that have adapted them? How do they ensure that this is a plan leaving no one behind? And how do they bring in the new voices that are out there into a movement? And so this year, I'm not saying we've got all the solutions, but this year, for the first time, the UN was mandated by every country to hold an annual SDG moment, an actual countdown every year in September, when world leaders gather, whether it be virtual as it is this year or not, to mark progress. They do have something in July, but it's at a more of a ministerial level. But now we have an opportunity to improve the accountability around the goals for each country, each leader. We have an opportunity to invite a movement to put their case every September. And I suppose our contribution to this is we want to make more famous and clearer the solutions that are out there and how everyone can play their part. And so I'm delighted to announce that next week, on Saturday, the 19th of September, there will be the first of its kind broadcast going out on YouTube and various broadcast networks, a show that the UN has developed in conjunction with ourselves, a 30-minute show, which will really highlight those solutions and really start to show how people can take action and where they can go to take part. So I think all of your points are valid, and I'm not saying we've got any of the answer, but I think this annual moment is a start, because it's where you get the most attention from world leaders, media and others, and everyone's got to turn up and show up at it.
Joshua, does that answer your question?
Yes, I was saying I recently was actually looking in a conference about getting political representation done, and they said one of the keys to getting awareness out there for issues like this is to get people going into community groups, getting people going into church groups, talking at schools, talking at libraries, and I think that you know, hopefully if this can give a platform for people to get more involved, to be a part of that call to action, I think that would be a brilliant thing.
Totally agree. I think the climate assembly that results that came out today are another good tool that I know many cities already do it around the world, but I think we can learn a lot from that.
Can I go to Alison, who was in the chat before? Alison, are you there? Hopefully magically appear. If not, maybe Ali.
Yep. Just unmuting. Sorry. Hi.
Yep. Hi. I'll go to Ali, since you just made a point about resetting our politics. Would you like to make it to David, and then we'll go to Alison? Sorry about that, Alison.
All right.
I'm confused.
Sure. David, I think we need new vocabulary. I think our politics is, as you rightly said, the separation of politics and policies is like olive oil and vinegar, you know, and these two are at times failing us. And I think we've moved from diplomacy to diplomacy in more ways than one. don't you think that, you know, a lot of these goals are like a compass, but the road hasn't been defined? And where are we going in terms of practicalities that you and Kate talked about? But for instance, look at Lesbos yesterday, which is hitting close to your heart, in Greece, and, you know, the camp of refugees, 13,000 Afghans, $2 trillion later, and you know, 2 decades, and we still, you know, haven't accomplished. Afghanistan is being blown up on a daily basis, and we're deploying funds for many things that are not in line with these goals. And this is 2 decades later. And I think with talking to Merope and the younger generation, we owe them, because a life has only so many decades of 10 years in it. Where are we going in terms of the alignment of politics and policies? And if the software has failed us, is it time for a new political architecture?
I'm so happy to be called part of the younger generation. David, I can't tell you. David.
Thanks. I just want to say something to Joshua, which is that, who was asking, what can you do? I mean, I think it's really important to think local. You know, the temptation for me as the leader of an aid organization is to say, oh, come and volunteer for us. But actually, in South Sudan, we employ the South Sudanese. In Syria, we employ Syrians. And so the message I would give to you is to think locally. From my point of view, it's about, I would say it's about integrating and supporting refugees and asylum seekers who are arriving in the UK, too few, unfortunately. But it's also using voice, and that links to that brilliant point that Ali just made about diplomacy. I think that's very, I'm going to use that, I'm going to steal that because I think there is a crisis of diplomacy. However, what I would say to you is that in the salad dressings that I make, olive oil and vinegar do mix. That's the whole point about them. And the politics and the policy do need to come together. I am probably of the wrong decades to start inventing a new political architecture, but I feel it's part of my job to say that the genuine crisis, even before COVID, in respect of the SDGs, 80% of fragile and conflict states were off track to meet the SDGs before COVID. And now we've got a health emergency around COVID, a health emergency around non-COVID vaccinations and things, and an economic emergency pushing people into famine and despair. So I think that we've got to look for that meld, and we've got to be able to tell a story that says, 1, a crisis of diplomacy leads to record numbers of refugees and displaced people. 2, a humanitarian development system that works separately from each other is never going to work properly. And you've got to tackle crisis and tackle poverty at the same time, and with common tools and aligned tools. Thirdly, there's a responsibility on richer countries to play their part. And no one's talked about this, but the COVID response that the UN calculated, they called for $10 billion to fight COVID in poor countries. They've raised $2.4 billion. Only 15% of that has gone to frontline NGO delivery. And so I think the voice about responsibility is as important as the voice about policy, as important as the voice about diplomacy. And it's hard for people to get their voice heard. I get that. But I think that if you look at the Me Too movement, if you look at Black Lives Matter, you're seeing what happens when there's a vacuum of government leadership. Mass mobilization can come in. And that's messy as well. But I think it's essential.
David, just on your point, I wondered if it feels to you like the whole COVID experience and story has just showed the lack of progress made on goal 17, which is of course revitalizing global partnerships. It feels like it's really exposed the lack of global partnerships. Does it feel like that from where you're sitting?
Well, it doesn't. I mean, Pascal Lamy, who was the head of the World Trade Organization, says you've got to look at the multilateral system, and that's not working. But he then says, look at what he calls the polylateral system. And by that, he means non-state engagement. Now, if you look at the way scientists, for example, are cooperating in respect of COVID, there's a lot of global cooperation. If you look, interestingly, I'm told about the way the pharmaceutical companies are working, you can also see cooperation. So I think it's a mixed picture. But on the political side, on the diplomatic side, obviously the US neuralgia about the World Health Organization is blocking everything from World Health Organization activity to the UN Security Council coming to any view. So interstate cooperation has been really week. I'm very encouraged. When I last did my tortoise thing, it was about in May, the EU was still in balk, really. I mean, the EU is motoring now on COVID response. So I think that there's some hope of a multilateral response there. But overall, I would say it's D minus for political cooperation in the COVID moment. And of course, the longer you wait on the prevention, the worse it gets. In the countries that we work in, the number of deaths is now recorded at over 120,000. The real number is going to be much higher. And the longer you wait on prevention, the greater the cost. And I think we're seeing a lot of local action. Interestingly, a lot of places that we work in Africa have not been hit in the way that we feared, but we're still clamoring for more effective filling of the holes in the global public health safety net.
Okay, thanks. And I owe it to Alison now to try you again. Alison, are you there? We can see you, but we can't hear you. There you go. No.
Sorry. Yeah, funny enough, I made my point just as David more or less made it as well, which is that we've had years of NGOs really putting themselves into boxes, because that's been the easiest way to, I think, often to fundraise, or as we've seen it, to tackle the issues. And it's interesting now, you know, that we're coming into a situation where it's almost the opposite. And I don't know how easy it is going to be to untangle that, or to get to NGOs to come together, because basically they often are competing for very finite resources anyway. So I'd really like David to talk about that again. How easy will it be for NGOs that have traditionally focused on quite narrow issues to actually begin to work together more? And is there ways in which a big organization like yours can encourage smaller ones to do that kind of cooperation?
Yeah, do you want me to answer that?
Yes, please, that would.
Yeah, so we're an organization of 13,000 employees and 17,000 volunteers in 200 field sites in fragile states around the world. We also do a lot of refugee resettlement in the US. And I think the agenda for the future is about partnering with local civil society in a way that doesn't say local civil society good, international NGO bad, but says we both have relevant expertise. So for example, we can do the impact evaluations. We do more research studies on what works in humanitarian settings than any other organization, and we make them open source, so we support them. Secondly, we can support local NGOs who don't want to take on compliance and other responsibilities. We can do the staff training that isn't easy for local and small NGOs to do. It's hard, but I think there is a meeting of minds where you have the global effort that is then supported by local expertise. 95% of the people we employ are local people, and we can do better, and we need to do better, especially in senior management positions. So I mean, there's a tendency to see localization as an alternative to the big international system. I think that's not going to work. You've got to say there's expertise that's local and there's expertise that's global, and they've got to be in a genuine partnership.
Okay, thanks. Could I go back to Kate to start with, but just to say that it seemed to me, reading around the goals, that part of the problem why they were falling short even pre-COVID was because there wasn't enough money, really. There wasn't enough money, and that seems even more of an issue now post-COVID. How are we going to address the financing that is needed to reach the goals that we want to? The big question in a post-COVID world.
I think David made the point about what is required for a people's vaccine, an equitable distribution of the vaccine when it comes, is probably the first thing that needs to be addressed. And it's not that much money. I was interested today if the report was right about from the medical journal about the cost of the testing, which is a lot of money, and you think all these things become a lot of money, but the counterbalance when things go wrong is always so much greater. So if you have to spend 100 billion now on testing, and you've taken some measures 5 years and every year up until now to invest in these things, it wouldn't be half as much. And so I think planning is going to be important. People are going to have to put some resilience measures in place, and they will. I mean, I don't mean to be flippant, but people said, you know, money doesn't grow on trees, but it sort of has with some of the things that have been going on. So maybe this is the time.
When they want it, doesn't it?
Braver and say, you know, if we don't start fixing the effects of climate change, we don't start addressing this crisis, we are just going to spend much more 5-10 years down the line. So let's do it now.
And, you know, it's one of the things that has really struck me, just in a personal perspective, just as a consumer, is that it really felt like we were making some headway towards goal 14, life below water, and plastic consumption. And it felt like a sort of, you know, international conversation, very, very present in the UK here, that plastic was bad. And just in one sort of sweep in a few short months, it seems like that's totally gone away. Plastic is back, single use, COVID, and it's hard to imagine the work that's going to have to be done to get that back at the top of the priorities list. Does it feel like it's a mountain to climb again, or that we can immediately get there once we found a vaccine?
I think the good news is we know how to do it, because we've
done it. We're on our way. Yeah.
So I think you've just got to remember that and keep the faith. It is possible. We've demonstrated it. You know, David's right about the complexity of those in poverty now, but 1 billion people raised out of poverty over the past 30 years is an extraordinary amount. And so I think with the innovations, with the global cooperation and the essential elements and addressing those finances, I think that, you know, it will be possible. But these big institutions have got to do something. The G20 has got to do something about it when it meets in November. It really does. And whether that is a tax change and address, you know, so be it.
Okay. Eddie, going back to you now, as an advocate for the goals, what's your priority now going forward?
Well, the priority really, for me personally, I mean, I work with 16 other advocates who are focused on different things, but for me, it really is to amplify the voices of the most marginalized communities. And I think that, you know, the global reckoning with race and Black Lives Matter has really revealed the cleavages in society and how, you know, when we speak in development terms of people that are actually bearing the brand of poverty are people of color, right? Both in the global North and the global South, right? So clearly we need to be able to bring these two conversations together, the social justice conversation and the international development conversation. And I think, unfortunately, we've not done that, right? We sort of think about the SDGs as, you know, purely a humanitarian conversation, which of course it is, but, you know, these things are overlaid with histories of injustice and histories of inequality, right? And so I think that, you know, there is an honest, sobering conversation that we need to have, because, you know, as far as I'm concerned, the emperor has no clothes, right? Like, I think it's incredibly evident that our inability to track inequality and track injustice against the backdrop of some of our other interventions are actually not just failing vulnerable communities, but they're actually compromising the agenda in its entirety. And so that would be my primary goal moving forward now.
And David, same question to you. What would be the top of your priority list?
Sorry, you'll have to say it again. I lost you.
Sorry, what would be the top of your priority list in order to start achieving these goals again post-COVID?
I think that global health provides us with an opening now to remake the argument for global cooperation. The pandemic has shown that this is a connected world. The pandemic has shown what happens when there are holes in the global safety net, but also holes in or weak links in global cooperation. And so my big idea is to use health and global public health security as a battering ram for a different kind of global cooperation that combines real responsibility according to wealth and power, but also proper cooperation at local, national, and international level.
Okay. Look, thank you all for joining us so much. It's been great to hear from you. As my colleague James Harding said just before, it feels a bit sometimes like we're ripping up the rule book and thinking about new ideas and new plans when there is a plan. And as Kate said at the start, the SDGs are the plan. They are the only plan, and we have to stick to them. It would be totally foolish to try and renegotiate something with hundreds of countries at this point, and how interconnected all the goals are was a really interesting point. I loved Eddie talking about how ambitious, how they weren't ambitious enough, the goals, and the idea of moving people from $1 to $3 a day just seemed sort of barely changes the dial for so many people. And David, for you pointing out that the goal is not a plan, and there needs an enormous amount of work to be done to get there, and how we need to take these ideas to scale to really get there. It was great to hear from Joshua talking about what he could personally do, and David saying, you know, rather than volunteer for me, it's important that you think locally. I loved Ali's phrase, the crisis in diplomacy. Like David, I think I'm going to steal that. I think it's really great, especially since David gave political cooperation a D- on their school report for COVID. It's safe to say that the pandemic has shown the wisdom inherent in the goals, and it's not a challenge that seems to be dealt with in isolation by every country, but I do hope if we can get back on track and end up with a more equitable, peaceful, resilient, prosperous society if we do follow them. I'd like to thank you all for joining this, the fifth thinking of the day. The next thinking is at 2 o'clock. It's on open borders. How can we make the case for globalization after a global pandemic? It's on this same Zoom link, so you can hang out here. We will go dark in a few minutes and put everyone on mute, but you'll get my colleague Sam's terrific soundtrack as usual. And if you're not a Tortoise member, please do join us for a 30-day free trial, which my colleague Kabasha will neatly put in the chat now. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you all to our brilliant guests. You've been really terrific. See you soon.